Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a look at the SMSL SD-9. This is a product that you might have never heard of unless you're specifically in the market for a network player type device. The SD-9 retails for $400 US or about 540 Australian dollars. And I want to say a huge thanks to Shenzhen Audio for making this review possible by sending me the SD-9 for review. Before I start to tell you about all of the different things that the SD-9 can do, and there are quite a lot of them, let's take a closer look at the device itself. So just to clarify, the SD-9 is just a source device. There's no DAC in here, there's no amp in here, it is purely a source. But in terms of being a source, there's lots of different ways it can work, and we'll go through those shortly. Before we get there though, I just want to highlight the form factor. It's the typical kind of rectangular brick style device that SMSL tend to be making at the moment, but there is one little catch. It might work really well sitting with the SU9 or SH9, but when you pair it up with some of SMSL's other devices like the SU8 series that I've got here, there's one little problem with the design, and that is it's just a little bit bigger all the way around. Now I found that slightly frustrating to me. It breaks up a nice little stack. If I had the SH8S and the SU8S together, the SD9 really stands out as not being quite right. So as I said, I think judging by the design where it's got the nice glass top here, I do think it's designed more for the 9 series than for the 8 series, so do be aware if aesthetics are really important to you. But as you just saw, you can always stack it on the bottom and just put the two 8 series DAC and amp sitting on top of it. While we're looking at the device though, we probably should go through a quick tour. The front panel's really simple. All you've got is a display here, which is quite a nice little display, but it is very small. And then we've got our control dial, which allows you to move through the menus and select menu items as well with a clicky button. Very, very simple. Most control though realistically is going to be done with the remote control. Moving around to the back is where things get a lot more interesting and it starts to tell the story better of what the SD-9 is really meant for. I'm going to start over here on my left hand side. And we've got a Bluetooth antenna first and foremost, so the SD-9 can both transmit and receive high quality Bluetooth signals. In other words, you can run this as a streaming device to your Bluetooth headphones, or you can run your Bluetooth source and send the music into the SD-9 and onto whatever your DAC is if your DAC's not already Bluetooth enabled. Moving on along the back, down here, what you won't be able to see from the video but you will see on the close-ups is a micro USB card slot, so you can have your tunes loaded up in a micro USB card, and that will handle up to 4 terabytes if I remember correctly. You've then got an HDMI socket, which is actually for I2S transmission. You've got a coaxial connection, AES EBU, USB-B to take an input from a PC, optical sitting above it, a pair of USB sockets which can be used either for external hard drives or to send the signal out of this and into a USB DAC, and then we've got our RJ45 connection for the LAN. The SD-9 is also Wi-Fi capable, so you can connect it up via Wi-Fi or hardwired RJ45 connection. Finally, we've got a power supply over there, of course, because it does need power. While we're thinking about all these connections on the back, it's worth pointing out that via the RJ45 socket, and therefore the connection to the internet and or your local home network, the SD-9 can source music from a NAS setup. So if you've got some sort of network server in your home with your music on it, it can take music from there. It can also take music via Airplay and or DLNA. I used it quite a bit, set up using Bubble UPnP as the app on my Android phone and streaming Tidal or Cobas through to the SD-9. It was a little bit glitchy at times when I tried to feed it direct from JRiver Media Center, and also the streaming services weren't quite perfect, but generally speaking it did okay. I would be skeptical of buying this purely as a DLNA solution, and it seemed to perform much better using local file sources in terms of whether it's a NAS drive, a physically connected hard drive to the SD9, or the USD card. Those are probably my preferences for how the SD9 works better. But you do have Airplay, you do have DLNA, and so there are multiple options with the SD9. It's a shame that it's not Roon ready, but I understand that Roon is probably a specific ecosystem of its own and may not be so easy for all devices to tie into. That said, if you can do it with a Raspberry Pi, it would be nice to see it on a device like this. So now that you know everything that can plug into the SD9 and what it's designed to do in terms of take all those different features and output them to a DAC, the three things we need to cover off are what it's like to use, how the outputs sound in terms of do they sound any different from one digital output to another, and then of course, what are the other features and functions? So let's start with the features and functions first. The SD9 here has a couple of extra tricks up its sleeve over and above being a simple receiver and transmitter of digital audio. Buried within its menu, and that is a slight problem, is that it's buried in a funny kind of spot in the menu, you've got the ability to tweak the sound seemingly within the digital domain. So within the settings for the SD9, there is both an equalizer and also a thing called MSEB, or Magic Sound 8-Ball. Let's start by talking about the EQ. The EQ is pretty straightforward. It gives you a simple set of presets, including things like rock, pop, and bulls. I'll come back to that soon. And it's also then got a custom option for a 10-band EQ that you can set up on your own. It's a graphic EQ, not a parametric EQ, so do take that into account. By the way, apologies for any continuity breaks in today's video. I'm having one of those days today and lots of interruptions, so if you do see any sudden jumps in my positioning or the positioning of the box on the table, things like that, I do apologise. Continuing on now to the MSEB, or the Magic Sound 8-Ball, it's not quite as 8-ball-y as it might sound, but it is a pretty cool feature. What the MSEB function does is allows you to tweak the general sound characteristics of the SD9 without necessarily having to get into the EQ. So instead of giving you specific frequency bands to worry about, it gives you overall sound characteristics to worry about. Things like bass extension, the bass elasticity, the transient attack, the sound of female vocals, general vocals, note weight or note thickness, all of that sort of information. In playing around with it, I'm not entirely sure how it's making the adjustments. I don't know if it's actually applying EQ, so I don't know if bass extension, for instance, is a little bit of boost or cut at only the sub-bass frequencies, or if it's more getting into things like applying harmonics to the sound, changing the way the waveforms are handled, the digital waveforms that is are handled. I'm not really sure. All I know is it provides subtle but noticeable differences and is a fun way to tune your system without potentially the pitfalls of full-on EQ curves. Something else that is worth mentioning is that the SD9 EQ can only work up to 48 kHz, whereas the MSEB function can work up to 96 kHz. So again, I'm not sure how it's applying the changes, I'm not sure what it's doing to the digital file, but the end result I found to be quite a good feature. The naming to me doesn't make a great deal of sense, because first of all, it's not like a Magic 8-Ball in the sense that it's not random, you have full control, and on top of that, there are 10 presets. So I don't know where the 8 came from, it's not like a Magic 8-Ball, there's more than 8 presets, but you get the idea. It's a nice function with some good customization available. So far we've got a device with lots of different connectivity, both for incoming sources of music and then outgoing digital connections to go out to your DAC. It's an extremely good device if you want to mix up what sort of sources you're using and or have different types of connections available. This is one of the first source devices that I've got where I can actually play with I2S. So I like its versatility, I like all of the things that it can do, and I also like the fact that it doesn't seem to hurt the sound in doing so. I was a little bit worried that a device like this might be damaging the audio quality by kind of overhandling it along the way. But what I found was that plugging it in through multiple different outputs, it was providing a really good listening experience. One thing I did find was there did seem to be quality variations between the different outputs. So I'm not going to say which were better and worse, but I could definitely hear differences, mostly between optical and then coaxial and USB. So the optical had a definite character of its own, and depending on what I was listening to, I couldn't really determine if I thought it was better or worse than the coaxial, for instance. The USB was a little bit harder to measure because the way the SD-9 works is if you're feeding it to an external DAC using USB, that overrides the other outputs. So I had to unplug the USB before I could try it with the optical or the coaxial. The output that really took my attention when using the SD-9 though was the aforementioned I2S. Now, I'm not experienced enough with I2S to say if it's always a better choice. I know there's some debate around as to whether it is or it isn't. All I know is that from the SD-9, it was clearly superior to the optical, coaxial, and I think the USB as well. So if I was going to run the SD-9 and I had the choice of I2S on my DAC, I would definitely be using it. It's certainly not that the other outputs are bad, but to me there was a greater sense of clarity, separation, and overall resolution, and we're talking maybe 1 to 2% difference, but it was a noticeable difference to me with the I2S over the others, which were also quite fine, but not quite as good. So to this point, we've got a streaming device with good inputs, great outputs, some nice little features and functions, and then the question comes, what's it like to live with? And the answer is it's a bit of a mixed bag. This is a product that I really want to love because it could be a really helpful device for a lot of people. But I'm left with very mixed feelings. On one hand, I love the fact that I can connect a hard drive or a micro SD card and make this a standalone source device playing into a DAC of my choice. That is fantastic. I also like the fact that theoretically I can stream Tidal, Cobas, I can stream from my local library here using JRiver into the SD-9, but in practice the playback from that was not always perfect. And even with the hard drive and the micro SD card, there were still a few bumps in the road. With streaming services and my local library, there were dropouts that I don't experience when using Roon and Roon endpoints. And then with the local content on the hard drive or the micro SD card, with those what I was finding was every now and again I would hit a track that the system just wouldn't play. Now these are all tracks that I've played flawlessly on my iBasso DX300, on my Chord Poly and Mojo using the micro SD card on there. I've played them all back on my computer with no issues, so there's something that's getting in the way of the SD-9 playing them back, even though they tout this as a device that will play anything. So there's just a few hiccups and bumps in terms of its compatibility and its kind of flawlessness of delivery that did leave me just a little bit underwhelmed with the SD-9. Some other things that I noticed was that the firmware seems to be a little bit raw. I mentioned before the preset Bulls is in there, which is obviously meant to be blues. There's also a glitch in the MSEB menu where some text obviously gets cut off and just gets left on screen. So there's little things like that that no doubt will get fixed in firmware, but it does just show that it's not quite as polished and refined as some devices might be. I also found the interface to be a little bit laggy when trying to exit the playback screen using the hard drive as the source. So I don't know if that was to do with the management of the file artwork or whether that was just the process of taking the files and recoding them to spit them out to the DAC. I'm not sure what the cause was, but it was a bit laggy for the first click to get out of the playing screen, and then getting into the file navigator, from there it was much smoother. Speaking of having to exit the now playing screen, that's another big issue for me. Some of the key functions you might want, like the shuffle option, repeat option, changing some of the playback settings like the MSEB or the EQ, all of that you have to exit the playing screen by a significant distance. So it's not just one click or two clicks. You've got to click right back through the menu and then find the EQ or the MSEB, all the playback functions buried within other menus within the SD-9. So it's very clunky and clumsy in that regard because there aren't very many direct control buttons on the remote control. While we're talking about exiting playback menus, if you are listening through DLNA, for example, and I think this might be true for Airplay as well, what you have to do is exit DLNA altogether in order to access any of those settings. So in other words, if you do want to tweak the EQ or the MSEB, you have to stop playback altogether, go over to those settings, tweak them with no music playing or start a different source, and then come back into DLNA. In the meantime, your DLNA source device, whether it's an app like WPNP or something on your computer like JRiver, those devices are going to lose sight of the SD-9 because you've exited DLNA mode. So there's a lot of lumps and bumps in the SD-9 that really prevent me from recommending it wholeheartedly. But it's not all bad. Where I've landed on the SD-9 after spending quite a bit of time with it is that if you're running a home network setup, or if you're willing to take the chance that you'll occasionally get disruptions feeding at Cobas, Tidal or Spotify using a DLNA server like Bubble UPnP, or I should say a DLNA app, if you're happy to take those chances with DLNA, or use a local home network system like a NAS setup or a locally attached hard drive or microSD card, in those cases, it's a pretty solid device. You may hit the occasional format issue where it doesn't want to play back a specific file, but in my experience, that might be 3 to 4 in every 100. And they're probably things that had I taken the time to shuffle through and work out which track it was, I probably could have fixed it. So ultimately, where I see this working really, really well, and where I would recommend it if you're in the market for what I'm about to say, is in the role of a music server to a DAC where you've got your local files. In case that's unclear or you're having trouble imagining what I mean, it would be a situation where, for example, you want your music library available in another room of the house. You could load this up with a microSD card or a hard drive, plug it in over there with no other cables connected except a hard drive plugged in and or a microSD card, connect it through to your DAC, and away you go with music. It's much simpler than having to have a whole computer or a Roon endpoint if you don't want to go down the path of getting Roon. It does potentially present a really simple and quite cost-effective setup. Personally, I would prefer a Raspberry Pi running as a Roon endpoint. I do think it works better, but it is also much more limited. It doesn't have all the outputs, it doesn't have features like the EQ or the Magic Sound 8-ball, it also won't do Bluetooth without modifications, you have to know how to set it up in terms of getting the image file and loading it onto the microSD card, so you can see there's arguments in both directions. I should point out at this point, you might be sitting there saying, what about Airplay, how does that work? Airplay works fine, it seemed to work consistently without any hiccups, but the sound quality is noticeably reduced compared to using it as a DLNA or a local music server. So that's why I'm not recommending it for Airplay. If it is for a secondary purpose where maximum sound quality isn't your main focus, then absolutely by all means, it could be a great option for Airplay too. But overall, I'd say this definitely works best with local music files either on a network drive or a directly connected device. And then it gives you amazing versatility in terms of how you spit that signal out and into your DAC or your Bluetooth headphones. It essentially can take a simple DAC like, say, a Bifrost 2 like I've got behind me, a Shelly Labs J2, any of those very simple, no frills, no fuss devices. It can take those and turn them into essentially a smart streaming device. So if you're happy with some of the caveats I've given, if some of the cons I've mentioned don't really worry you, then the SD-9 could be a great option. If you're looking for a really polished experience, you probably want to look elsewhere at this stage. Maybe in time, firmware developments will improve this, but right now it is a little bit clunky. It does have a few hiccups and issues with certain playback sources, but other than that, I think it's a decent and solid device for a simple plug-and-play type solution with local files. If that sounds good to you, I'll put a link down below through to Shenzhen Audio to say thank you to them for sending through the SD-9. There's no kickbacks or affiliates or anything there, it's just a way to say thank you. If you've enjoyed this review, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like, and maybe think about sharing the video with somebody else that you know might enjoy this. Maybe your favourite hi-fi forum. Either way, thanks for watching. For now, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.